on. John chapter 10, Jesus is explaining the Good Shepherd. One of the coolest passages. I'm going to read 2 verses. Jesus says, "To him the gatekeeper opens, the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice." Excuse me. It's a beautiful picture that Jesus creates, and he creates this picture, this metaphor of this sheep, this group of sheep that are in the pasture, and they have a shepherd, and they all knew when a sheep calls, excuse me, the sheep follow. They won't come to people who they don't recognize their voice. I witnessed this when I grew up working on Jeff Miller's grandfather's farm. He would call the cows, and I would try to imitate his voice. Jeff would try it. We would all try doing it, and he had this call for the cattle, and I can try it. Not that good at it, but he would go, "Come on! Come on!" And so we would try to imitate his voice exactly, and it was one of those things, like it just the pitch was right, everything just sounded right. And when we would call, the cattle would they would look around and they wouldn't move. And when Grandpa Lure would call, "Come on," they'd all come run. They would just beat feet and they would come running. They knew his voice. And him and his son Kelly were the only 2 people who the cattle would come for. Period. There were no exceptions. This is the picture that Jesus paints, and he says, "My sheep come because they know my voice. I call them by name, and they come." It denotes intimacy. It denotes that we have a father and his son who know us by name and who call us and who care for us and who protect us. I want you to imagine what it would be like. Envision a world where everybody took care of each other. Where when people came in that wanted to devour people, people would intercede. Could you imagine? If you had people intercede, and if we had such a relationship with our neighbors and with each other, that when we called, they would follow. You ever notice sometimes it's like pulling teeth to get people to do anything? You're like, "Come on, we invite them over for dinner," or whatever it is. "It'll be good. We'll have fun. We'll have a good time. It'll be encouraging." And they're like, you know. Envision this. What this would look like if you said, "Hey, come along," and people followed. But it was for the good and the well-being of everybody. A little pop quiz for you. What was, in the Old Testament, what was the prison sentence for Jewish people who violated any of the laws within the Bible code? I'll give you an answer. There was no prison. Jewish people didn't have prison. Why? Because God developed a system that was unique to the Jewish people. Everybody else had prisons. Jewish people didn't. You see, God developed a system where people cared for each other and where they, to adopt the term of one of my friends, they nipped things in the bud. They didn't allow people to mistreat people for lengthy periods of time. They would intercede. They would help each other out. They had cities of refuge. All of this was built into the law of Moses. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And then Jesus comes along and he paints this beautiful picture. I remember this will be branded on my brain forever because it just meant so much to me. But when my daughter was, I think she was 3 at the time, we were getting her ready for bed, and she just crawled up into my arms and she said, "Daddy, I feel safe when I'm in your arms." And it melted me to my core, and I thought, isn't this the picture that God paints for us? That we have a God where we feel safe in his arms. Did you ever notice the crowds that followed Jesus? Do you ever notice the types of people who followed him en masse? People who are hurt, people who are physically ill, people who are spiritually ill, people who had been pushed aside by society, people who are marginalized, people who are oppressed, people who are abused. They came and they flocked to Jesus in droves. Why? Because they felt safe in his arms. Jesus says, I know my sheep, and I call them by name, and they follow me. It's an awesome, beautiful picture. I want to go into our text in Hebrews chapter 13, and this is a beautiful, beautiful text. Beautiful text. Let brotherly love continue. Isn't that just a beautiful way to start this? Let brotherly love continue. Never let it stop. Never let it lose momentum. Never let it slow down. Never let it start to fall apart. Just let brotherly love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. Remember those who are in prison. Now keep in mind, this is not Jewish prison. Jewish people didn't have prison, but Jewish people were imprisoned. As we find Paul's missionary journeys and such, Jewish people were persecuted and they were put in prison by the Romans. Remember those who are in prison as though in prison with them. Empathy. And those who are mistreated, since you also are in the body. He's not talking about this body. Remember last week we talked about this body metaphor for the church. The church is a body. If one part suffers, it all suffers. And I said, you never realize how powerful this little thing is until you hit it with a hammer. Your entire body just drops to the ground when you hit this thing. It's so powerful. And Paul creates this beautiful picture in 1 Corinthians 12, and he says, man, the body of Christ is made up of all these members, and there is no such thing as disposable parts. Every single part has a function, and every single part is doing what it's designed to do as God arranged it. It's a beautiful picture. What this verse is saying is, remember those who are being mistreated in prison as though you were in prison with them. And those who are mistreated, since you also are part of the body. This is talking about brothers and sisters who are put in prison. Let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled. By the way, do you know why God was so mean when it came to having just one wife and, having one husband? And why was he so strict on purity? Why was he so strict? For the sake of your children. Do you ever talk to anybody who has children in the mix of a failing marriage, or especially a marriage where there was infidelity? Pretty ugly, isn't it? Pretty hurtful, isn't it? See, God designs these things to protect each other and to care for each other and to show people and demonstrate to your children what love and what commitment looks like to each other. Let the marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous. Keep your life free from the love of money, and be content with what you have, for he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? Remember your leaders, those who spoke to you the word of God. This word for leader means somebody who's a guide, somebody who goes out before you. It's the same picture that Jesus quotes in John chapter 10. Jesus uses the same word, this word to lead, to go out in front of, to be a guide. The shepherd is leading the way. He's being the guide, and the sheep are following. Why? Because he knows them by name, and they trust him. I feel safe in your arms. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Do not be led away by diverse and strange teachings, for it is good for the heart to be strengthened by grace, not by foods, which have not benefited those devoted to them. What he's saying is he's going back to the sacrificial system. He's saying it's not about foods being unclean and clean and what foods are good for you and what foods are bad for you. That's not what strengthens your heart up. Doing everything right and making sure you don't do anything wrong, that's not what builds your heart up. What builds your heart up is grace. Right? It's the way we care for one another. It's the way that we forgive each other. It's the way that we treat each other. That's what builds the heart up. We have an altar from which those who serve the tent have no right to eat. For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy places by the high priest as a sacrifice for sin are burnt outside the camp. There are parts of the animals, under the old sacrificial law, there are parts of the animals that are thrown out. They would carry those parts of the animals out. It was the internal organs, some of the things that were not fit for consumption. They would carry them outside of Jerusalem. They had a designated spot, and there was a big fire that was going 24/7, and they would throw those remains of the animals, whatever was left over, the junk of the animal, they would throw on top of this fire, and they would consume it. It was smelly. It was gross. It was not a fun job for those who had to carry their remains out there. But he draws this picture. Now listen to this. He says, verse 12, so Jesus also suffered outside the gate. Jesus was thrown away. Jesus was treated by the Romans and by the Jews as this throwaway piece that nobody wanted, and it was, let's just take him outside of the city and let's hang him on a cross and let's get rid of him. Jesus suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. Therefore, let us go to him outside the camp. You know what the translation is? Let us go to Jesus at the cross. The ugly place where Jesus was thrown out, the smelly place, the place that's outside the camp, the place where Jesus was just thrown out. Let's go to him there and bear the reproach he endured. What does that mean? Let us bear the reproach that Jesus endured. Let's understand suffering. Why? Here's the question, why? So that we can just subject ourselves and feel bad all the time? No. It's so that you remember those who are in prison as if you were in prison with them. Guys, how can we empathize with people who are suffering around us if we've not borne that burden of suffering and gone to Jesus at the cross? Such a humble place to be. For here we have no lasting city, but we seek the city that is to come. Through him, then, let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God, that is the fruit of lips that acknowledge his name. Do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. Isn't that beautiful? In this verse, I don't like this harsh translation because I think when you read it in the original language, it's such a beautiful picture. Listen to this. Be persuaded by your guides. Be persuaded by your guides and yield to them. You notice the difference? I'm translating this literally. The way that this is translated, this passage has been misused for so long. Obey your leaders and submit to them. That's how we've used that. That's not what this means. This is going back to John chapter 10. They follow him because they hear his voice. He calls them by name. and they follow. I feel safe in your arms. Be persuaded by your guides and to yield to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls as those who will have to give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with groaning, for that would be of no advantage to you. I want to close with this, because this is so important for us to get. We talked about this in a Bible class earlier. This does not just mean people who are leading, as in the sense, we think leaders and we think, well, preacher, elders, and deacons. This is not what it's talking about. Leaders is any guide who is out in front of you, who's caring for and nurturing your soul. It's somebody who's protecting you, somebody who's shielding you, somebody who's laying everything on the line like Jesus did in John chapter 10 for the sake of your name, for the sake of your soul. It's somebody who's willing to lay down their lives in order to protect you and shield you with theirs, and they do it joyfully. Let them do that joyfully. Anybody who's leading you, when you come back and you say, I feel safe in their arms, what it's saying is don't come back to the shepherd and be like, no. And you're like, you ever have a little kid do that to you? They're like trying to get your attention. They're kicking you in the leg. Hey, you, that. That's not what it's saying. It's saying allow them to do this with joy. And not with groaning, for that would be of no advantage to you. Those of us who are guides, we lead other people, we shepherd them, we go before them, we live our lives for their sake, to teach and instruct them and to show them how to live their lives. That's called discipleship, by the way. We disciple them and we take them by our side and we say, here's the way. You know what? Like, it's not okay for people to bully people over and over and over and over again. That's not okay. Like, we teach people. If we see that kind of stuff, like, we intervene because we want to. It's a joy to do it. And these people have to give an account. When you take the charge and you say, man, I'm going to protect other people and I'm going to shield them with my life. Parenthood, by the way, makes us highly accountable to God. When you become a parent, you become highly accountable to God. And anybody who's guiding anybody else becomes highly accountable to God. But it's not this burden. It's a joy to do it. I'm going to close with this passage. You all know it. You could probably recite it by memory. But this is the God who we serve. Such a beautiful, incredible picture. Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. That doesn't mean I shall not want him. It means I shall not be in want. There's nothing that I want. When I'm in the presence of my God, there's nothing else that matters. Paul said it. I considered everything else rubbish. Right? Paul said, I preached Jesus Christ and him crucified. Nothing else mattered. When he was in the presence of God, nothing else mattered. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. This is somebody who you can see your enemies. Your enemies are right there, and you know what? You're at peace. Why? Because you feel safe in his arms. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Amen. If there's anybody here who has any prayer needs or anybody who's not yet taken that step to put Christ on in baptism, I encourage you to do that. I encourage you, just as importantly, to go out and to find out and ask God, am I one of these leaders that he's talking about? Am I a guide for somebody? And if so, how do I improve that? How do I improve upon that and really care for people in this nurturing sense where I know them by name and I call their voice and they're going to come, they're going to follow me, they're going to come be in my presence, and they're not going to fear the enemy, they're not going to be anxious and depressed and worried and angry and bitter, and they're going to come and they're going to sense the presence of Jesus, and they're going to feel safe for his sake. I encourage you to go out and do that. If there's anybody who wants to be baptized or a prayer needs, you can come forward, or our shepherds will be in the back as we stand and sing.